Welcome to Stranger Things in the 1980s. My name is Vince Locke. I am your host. In this podcast, my guest and I take deep dives into the Upside Down, where we analyze each episode of the Netflix series along with related movies and books, and examine them in the context of 1980s America. Thank you for joining us. I want to start by giving you some background information on me and on this podcast. I grew up in the 1980s in the American Midwest, specifically in the state of Michigan. And for the past more than 20 years now, I've been teaching college courses in writing and literature. In fact, this podcast began as a university literature course I taught in the fall of 2019, just before the COVID pandemic hit. I really enjoyed teaching that course. But unfortunately, because of the pandemic and related reasons, I've not been able to teach it since then. And so I decided to turn it into a podcast so that I can scratch that itch. The goal of the podcast is to be educational, so I hope you find it interesting and informative. If you have any questions or topic suggestions, please email me at dreadpirateproductions@gmail.com. In this first episode, I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Brian Stout, as we discuss the first chapter of Stranger Things, The Vanishing of Will Byers.
Okay, so I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Brian Stout. Brian, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself? Tell us who you are and what you do.
Well, by day, I'm a learning consultant. So I design training for a major retail company. Some of the other things that I do also, though, on the side, I write articles for a magazine in the town that I live in. So I cover film and music and podcasts, basically whatever I want to, pop culture wise, and do some other freelance writing, but basically anywhere I can flex my love of music and films and TV and into something where I get to nerd out with people like you is really what I'm into.
Awesome. Now, we were talking earlier and you said that, of course, you'd seen Stranger Things before and you had to refresh yourself, much as I have. What is it about the show that you think really appeals to you? What do you like about it?
Well, for me, I think, part of it is I'm a child of the 80s and it's a total throwback. You know, it looks, the first thing I thought when I watched that first episode, when I didn't know very much of anything about it, when a lot of us were just clicking on it because it looked kind of cool, was just that it struck me that it had that old Spielberg energy that I loved so much in movies in the 80s, like Poltergeist and E.T. obviously is a major point there, and then there's some of those Stephen King elements too, like we were talking about. And so it really just hit a lot of those notes that are, nostalgia for me that were important. And I think just also that setting is close enough to kind of what, kind of the area that I grew up in. I grew up in Flint, Michigan, and that Midwest kind of.
Absolutely.
I was properly in the city, but I had lots of friends who lived in kind of just outside of the city, and it had that vibe that felt very Midwest. And
absolutely, it's the same with me. It feels like it really captured my childhood really perfectly, kind of disturbingly well. But yeah, that's what appealed to me too.
Yeah, just riding your bike all day with those 4 kids that you're friends with and getting into mild trouble,
talking about comic books and movies and music. Exactly. Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, so this is the first chapter of the show, The Vanishing of Will Byers. And I like how these episodes are structured as specifically chapters. This is really not so much a TV show as it is like a visual novel, the way it's structured. So each season of the show, it's not really a season, it's a book. So you have Stranger Things and then Stranger Things 2 and 3, which are sequels to the first visual novel. And so it's structured in chapters. So chapter 1, The Vanishing of Will Byers. What do you think about that title? What do you think that title means?
Well, I mean, it's literally what happens in the first few minutes of the show.
Mm-hmm.
I think that I mean, if I saw that in a book, I would think immediately that there's, it would give me it gives you a sense of danger right away. There's an idea that, you know what's going to go on, but you don't know why, or at that point, if you just look at the title, you don't even know who that is yet. So
really piques the interest. But
mm-hmm.
wouldn't it be easier to say like the disappearance of Will Byers? Why not the vanishing? It seems to me that the use of the word vanishing is kind of odd.
Yeah, for me, the vanishing is definitely an important term there. I think that it implies something different than disappearance. For some reason, vanishing to me has a sense that it gives me a sense that he will come back. There's like a vanishing and then some sort of return. Like disappearance just sounds a little less mysterious, I guess, for lack of a better term.
I think you make a good point. There is the implication that he will come back, or there will be a return. To me, the term vanishing, I associate it with magic. Because if you think about, disappearing acts, magicians don't really call them disappearing acts. They call them vanishing tricks, right?
Sure,
so
yeah.
The idea of vanishing is something which I associate, like I said, with magic and with something that is more illusory. It also makes me think of the term vanishing point in art, which I don't know if you're familiar with this, but vanishing point is a way of creating the illusion of 3D imagery on a two-dimensional plane by drawing lines that are angled in such a way that they disappear into the background or seem to disappear into the background to the point that's called the vanishing point. So, and I think that is thematically relevant with what's happening, particularly in this first season, is, Will does vanish. He doesn't disappear. He's not gone. He's just not visible. He's essentially there, but there is a veil between him and the rest of the world. So it has that sort of mystical, magical aspect to it. Now, as we have talked about, this show has a lot of, I don't know if we can call them Easter eggs, but a lot of references to pop culture. One of the earliest ones, I think, is to The Hobbit. So we get the reference to Mirkwood, for example, which is where Will goes missing, or where he vanishes. And then there's a reference to Radagast as the password to Castle Byers. Radagast being the wizard, one of the wizards from the Lord of the Rings mythology. And a lot of these references, these pop culture references, do seem to be used thematically. So yeah, I mean, I think it seems pretty obvious that if you're familiar with The Hobbit, I mean, they don't mention the full title in the episode. They just, Lucas and Dustin get into a little disagreement over where Mirkwood appears, whether it's Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit. But if you're familiar with the works of Tolkien, The Hobbit is an unexpected journey. That is exactly what happens with Will here. It is an unexpected journey. Also, I want to ask you, what do you think about Eleven's physical appearance in this first episode?
Well, I think that it was, 11 to me maybe not physically, but certainly recalls Drew Barrymore in Firestarter to me, and that she just seems to be sort of this unknown. I think it was interesting that they, the choice that she looks very androgynous in the beginning. Yes. She doesn't really, like, she's even mistaken for a boy in that first sequence by the guy who owns the diner.
Right.
I think that's, obviously there's a point there, because I think it seems that it's much easier for her to maybe sort of hide amongst these boys. I think had she looked more like a girl, and then later on, it's kind of a bigger deal when she starts to look more feminine as the show goes on.
Exactly. And mentioning Firestarter, we will discuss Firestarter in an episode later on down the road. But one thing that struck me about Firestarter is there is a sort of androgyny in that character of Charlie, Drew Barrymore's character in the film. You know, the name Charlie itself is androgynous.
Yeah, I was just going to say right down to the name.
Yes, exactly. So there is, I think, a thematic relevance there. But also when we first see 11, she is, you know, she has a very close haircut, and she's wearing a hospital gown. And that strikes me as an evocative image. It makes me think of two things, or two things immediately come to mind. One of which is the Holocaust, especially in relation to her tattoo. So if I recall seeing pictures of, you know, Holocaust survivors in concentration camps from World War II, having a very similar appearance to that, very gaunt, very malnourished, you know, closely shaved heads, and often in hospital gowns or that sort of clothing. But it also reminds me of, and I think this becomes more relevant later on in this first season, of cancer patients. What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, I think there's even a line, I think, where one of them says something like, I can't remember if it's to her or amongst themselves, where they said something where they alluded to they weren't sure if she was sick. And yeah, I mean, both of those things are pretty powerful. And you know, I mean, I always assume that there is a purpose behind everything that's on screen. There's
yeah. It is in episode 2 when I think it's Dustin asks if she's sick, if she has cancer or something along those lines. And I just want to say, in terms of spoilers, feel free to spoil this because, I mean, this show has been out for several years now, and I'm sure our listeners will be familiar with what's going on in the show. But cancer does become, especially in this first season, kind of a recurring motif or even metaphor. It could be and in fact, I think within the show itself, it is being used as a form of foreshadowing, especially drawing parallels between 11 and Will. So 11's physical appearance, I think the fact that there is an androgyny there, I think is also reflective of Will, because there is a question about Will's gender identity, perhaps. If you recall when Joyce goes to Hopper to report that he's missing.
Yeah, that's right. I know what you're talking about.
Yeah. So Hopper asks her about Lonnie, her ex-husband. You know, he's probably just with Lonnie, because usually what he says is 9 out of 10 times when a child goes missing, it's a custodial issue, usually with the other parent. And Joyce makes the point that Lonnie didn't really like Will because he suspected that Will was queer, as she said. So there is that issue of androgyny or sort of gender identity.
Yeah, and that actually reminded me of I think when she's trying to convince Hopper to look for her or to take it more seriously, she said something, she makes some reference to the kids calling him names and using a slur for queer kids, and you know, that was very popular in the 80s, but is fortunately on its way out. I remembered that, that jumped out at me. The other thing that I thought of when you mentioned that too is that it also kind of sets up the look of 11 initially, also kind of sets up the idea that she sort of takes his spot in the group for a while. And so she doesn't, you know, she sort of fits into that. And she also, and not just in the sense that she has, you know, short enough hair to look boyish, but also kind of like that, just like what you're saying about her being kind of androgynous, like she's sort of, you know, because there's this sort of question about Will, there's also, she sort of fits right into that spot very nicely.
Very much so. Can you think of other examples in the show where there is a sort of parallel between those two characters? Because you're right, you know, when the boys are playing D&D, Will is the wizard character, And when 11 comes in and joins the group, she essentially is a wizard.
Yeah, that's true. She has, magical powers. So
Yeah, exactly. I
yeah,
mean, literally magical powers.
It's like literally a wizard. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was thinking of something else though too that just kind of builds the case a little bit for them, for the Byers kids being kind of outside the norm, because the brother, there's a flashback sequence in the first episode where he's rattling off all these different groups of bands that he likes, and he's kind of like they take a moment to sort of set him up as the outsider, and then it becomes a little more clear even when he's out posting up he's putting the poster up, and the other the
Now
cool
that you
kids are,
mentioned
like,
it,
surrounding
yeah.
him.
Especially in the second episode, that we see more of Jonathan and his sort of relationship with the other teenage characters. And he is, they do tease him, they do mock him. There is the suggestion that they think maybe he's gay too. So
Yeah.
I hadn't thought about it. I hadn't made that connection. But yeah,
Well,
what is it, do you think, that really sets the Byers family apart from everyone else?
Well, one of the things that jumped out at me, and you may need to keep me honest on this, but is his family the only one that has a divorce in it?
I believe so.
Because I was thinking that everybody else, the other families I remember seeing, were intact.
We're definitely set up to sort of
episode.
Contrast the Byers family to the Wheeler family. And the Wheeler family is very much that, two parents, a household where it's a traditional father works, mother's the homemaker.
Stereotype city. The dad is super clueless. And like,
absolutely.
Like that one bit where he goes like, "What did I do? Tell me what I did wrong."
Exactly, which comes back several times throughout the series.
Yeah.
Just about how useless he is. Yeah. So yeah, we do have the comparison or the contrast drawn between those two. But even in later seasons, we see Dustin's family. He's a single parent household. He has his mother. We don't know where the father is. He's just sort of absent. And then when we do see Lucas's family, that is another sort of stable, traditional family structure there, two-parent household. But yeah, definitely in this first season, there is that contrast between the Wheelers and the Byers families. Also, I think economics play a role here, because the Wheeler family is very much that middle-class suburban family, whereas the Byers are the working-class poor people, if you will.
Yeah, maybe that's a more clear distinction, as it goes on, I think. But it did jump out at me initially in that first episode that it looks like there's they do seem to go to lengths to kind of show how they're kind of on the wrong side of the tracks, if you will. And then that sort of sets the tone for all this other types of derision that come up. There's, and then also like, with them questioning their orientations and everything.
Yeah.
And then even like the next layer of that is also that the dad is, there's also some allusions to the dad being more like masculine, macho, traditional kind of, and that he didn't like that the kids like things that he didn't enjoy.
And that is depicted much more in later episodes, but yeah, definitely so.
Yeah, I just remember when Jonathan was rattling off all the bands that he likes and he has Evil Dead poster on the wall. It was like, oh, felt like I probably would have been talking to him if we went to the school.
We'll definitely get to that. Yeah, because the posters are very, very telling, I think. As well as the music, especially in this first season. The music in the first season seems to be used in a very thematic way. It's not just 80s music too, so it's not just setting the scene, but the music actually plays a role in helping to tell the story. Now,
that White Rabbit needle drop, for example.
Oh yeah, definitely. What do you think? Well, since we're talking about the music, what do you think about the music?
The thing that I wrote down when I was watching it today was just that it seemed very Midwest. Like there's this, and in the Midwest, in my experience, like a lot of the people I was around were into classic rock or whatever was on the radio. And the two things that jumped out at me in this episode was White Rabbit and then also Africa, which is of course a major, like a Toto song. And, those of you who are younger are like, oh, that Weezer song, right? But those two things jumped out at me for sure as, reminding me of my growing up. Like my parents would listen to the radio and we'd hear the top 40 songs. And then my other friends who had parents who were more into music, they would often have classic rock on.
Yeah, and those two songs in particular are really featured in this episode. So White Rabbit, why do you think that song's being used?
I think that's definitely in reference to 11, I think is really the key there. Just this idea of her being kind of a test, if you think about rabbits being tested or being used as test subjects.
That's a good point. I didn't make that connection.
Oh, really? Huh.
No.
That's the first place my head went, was like, I got an image of a white rabbit. And then I thought, oh, she's like the rabbit. She's being tested, and reminded me of all those pro-vegan things I used to see in the 90s that would have Gillette shaves years off of animals' lives and these horrible images.
Oh, I remember those.
Animal
Yeah.
testing. Yeah. So I'm strewn around the university all the time.
So White Rabbit, for me, the connection that I always make is to Alice in Wonderland.
Oh, yeah, totally.
Which is kind of
makes plenty of sense.
I mean, it is sort of explicitly in the lyrics, go ask Alice, and it's using imagery from Through the Looking Glass. But that's where my mind usually goes. But yeah, I think you make a really interesting point, because we're meant to associate that song with 11. And so the idea of the rabbit as being the test subject, the doy, yeah. That didn't
the other thing that I was thinking about is that 11, I think there's something to that too. So it's like a 1-for-1 swap. She winds up jumping into the group with Will, where Will was. There's that whole thing. Like I remember going, speaking of rabbit holes, I remember when I saw that Jordan Peele movie, Us, I was super obsessed with all the different 11s that are all over the place and all the parallels between the families, and right down to things like the Tim Heidecker's family. The girls were wearing Black Flag t-shirts, which was 2 sets of bars, which looks like 2 11s.
Oh, wow.
There's another, at the carnival, there's a part where the guy's wearing a Black Flag t-shirt. There's a whole bunch of 11s all over the place in it. I went super deep dive into that movie because there's so much to unpack there. Wrong podcast, but
right. But yeah, that's a good point. So I didn't even think about that too, because I always wondered, what is the significance of 11 in particular? I mean, yeah, she's the 11th test subject, but why 11 in particular?
Mm-hmm.
But I like that idea of being a 1-to-1 ratio. Yeah, I think there's something to that. And of course, White Rabbit, traditionally the song is regarded as being about drugs and acid trips.
Mm-hmm.
And there is certainly some of that happening with 11, because as we learn, her powers are the result of experiments with drugs and psychedelics. But yeah, just the idea of White Rabbit being a reference to Alice in Wonderland and going through the looking glass. I mean, 11 kind of metaphorically does go through the looking glass, and that she is in a world that is completely different from what she's been raised in. So she is a stranger in a strange land, as it was.
Yeah. And then there's the whole looking glass and underneath, or upside down,
the upside down, especially because that's what happens with Will. He has literally gone through not literally gone through a looking glass, but very much gone through into a different dimension, a different realm. So yeah, White Rabbit is very much, I think, thematically important here. How about Africa? Because that is another song they really hit on.
Well, I think
by Toto, by the way, not by Weezer.
Right. Well, actually, the Toto element of it is the thing too. So Toto is like a repetition as well. T-O-T-O.
Oh, good
and then
point.
There's 11, and there's these are the kinds of little weird things that I pick up on when I watch some of this stuff. But yeah, my first thought about that is that I just remember that song being so hugely popular.
Yes.
It was inescapable.
And I think that's really what they're sort of alluding to here, is the pop nature of it.
Mm-hmm.
Because When do you recall when that song is played in the show?
Oh man, I think is it when Nancy and Steve are hanging out together?
Yes.
That's what I thought.
Yes.
Which
So,
totally makes sense. It's like a make-out song.
okay, I hadn't thought of that, but yeah, that's a good point. But also, I think we're meant to connect that song with specifically with Nancy and with Steve, the popular kids, right?
Oh
And of
yeah,
course,
for
if you
sure.
contrast that with music that Jonathan listens to, not the pop stuff at all, totally
Yeah.
the alternative punk, new wave,
Mhm.
very much, I think, establishing musically the relationship between these sort of teenagers within the story. And of
Yeah,
course,
that makes
Africa
sense.
has that mystical element too, blessing the rains in Africa. And of course, it's raining when that song is used in the episode.
Mm. I cannot remember the names of the bands that Jonathan references off the top of my head, but I do recall that they were like um, the bands that I've come to like from that era a lot as I discovered them
Oh yeah,
when I was out on
and
my
I'm
own.
not sure exactly which ones he references specifically, but we do. We get New Order in there, Joy Division.
That was one that he referenced. Yeah, Joy
That
Division.
is, yeah, Joy Division. Oh, and I'm completely drawing a blank on right now. Should I Stay or Should I Go? Who did that?
Oh yeah, he plays that in the car later. The
Yeah,
Clash.
that's
Yeah.
another dominant song.
Yeah, and that was a major hit for the Clash. That's kind of
The
an
Clash, yes,
interesting.
thank you.
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting. Maybe it's interesting that that was played in the car
Hmm.
on the radio, even though the Clash is likely a band that he probably liked and maybe thought that was one of their lesser efforts because
Right. I mean, technically it was a pop hit, but yeah,
Yeah.
the Clash is very much an alternative kind of band compared to like Toto, right? It's not as pop.
Yeah, like the Clash would certainly appeal more to like Jonathan than Nancy and Steve, I would assume.
And I think that does a really good job of illustrating how there are three different storylines happening within this first season, that you're following three different groups of characters. So you do have the teenagers, you have the contrast between Jonathan and Nancy and Steve. You have that triangle there. But then you also have what's happening with Hopper and Joyce.
Mm-hmm.
And then what's happening amongst the boys in 11. So we have three, on the surface, separate storylines, but as the season goes on, they start to merge and we see how they're related specifically. Now, you had mentioned earlier about, well, we both had mentioned when we were talking about how the Byers family is on the outside. Do you think that's one of the reasons why the police seem so unconcerned or uninterested in pursuing Will's being missing?
Oh, certainly. I'm sure that's part of it. I mean, any child of the 80s knows that there was all this panic around stranger danger and kidnapping cases. There were a number of high-profile cases like that, like Adam Walsh and some of those other. I feel like there's a couple others, but all of that tied into this real panic about like a child going missing. I mean, I remember sitting through so many videos and PSAs that scared me of strangers. And there's a lot of really great pods now that are kind of reevaluating that time period and things like Satanic Panic and some of those other cornerstones of the 80s paranoia. And so yeah, it's interesting that he didn't that they were not all that interested in him disappearing, and they sought to just kind of, I mean, even the very, like you mentioned, even just the very first answer was just like, oh, he probably went to his dad's house. I mean, that's even a direct reference to that broken home situation that there is.
And Hopper says, I used to go off on my own when I was a kid too. I was, screwing this girl in the back of my parents' car. And Joyce has to make the point, well, he's not like you, Hopper. He's not like most kids. Right.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, initially Hopper's very dismissive of it. Why do you think that is? Because you're
Well,
right, going back to the whole idea of stranger danger, which is appropriate considering Stranger Things. That
mhm.
was a concept that really came to the forefront in the 80s. Now, this is set in 1983, so it's kind of early in that sort of social movement. But yeah, the paranoia from that you see in the 80s, dealing with the satanic panic, as we'll talk about later, and stranger danger, and even just what's going on with the Cold War. Um, that's really starting to take off at this point in time.
Mhm. I, for me, I think a lot of it again goes back to just that class element, that there's not, there's just, I mean, we've seen repeatedly that where there's almost always more attention placed on, more concern over children from upper middle class environments, that
Hmm.
if they disappear or something happens to them, there's a lot more care and concern over that, and without opening that entire can of worms. So it's just, there's just a whole, I mean, again, thinking back to growing up in like Flint, Michigan, and thinking about how if one of our friends would have disappeared, it probably would have gone down more like, the situation with Will, like just kind of like, oh, he probably went to his dad's or something. Oh, and this just popped into my head also. I was thinking about how that whole the situation of the Byers family is also a little bit like the family in E.T.,
Yes.
although they do have Gertie.
Yes.
But yeah, like there's
And
there's
that
some
family's a little bit
divorce.
more middle class, but yeah,
Yeah.
similar parallels. And
Mhm.
yeah, we will talk about ET later, very much so. But yeah, you're right. Definitely getting that Spielberg vibe happening. And to me, I think going back to the idea that the police are so blasé about it, it's kind of a generational thing too, I think, because they're older, they're you know, baby boomers. Their experience growing up was different from us Gen Xers, right?
Mhm.
So the whole concept of stranger danger, I mean, certainly children were abducted throughout history, but it wasn't something that people were really aware of. It wasn't really hit on something to be paranoid about until really in the mid 80s, I think. And it was really what happens with Adam Walsh in particular that gets that ball rolling. But I
Mhm.
think at this point in time, it's representing um, a sort of lack of concern about it because it wasn't something to be concerned about at that time.
Mhm.
I mean, viewing it now, you know, modern viewers, I think, would be like, why are the police being so hesitant? Why are they just blowing this off? And then this is something which is really serious. To a modern sensibility, that would be the initial reaction. And so I think it's unusual for modern audiences to see police behave in this unconcerned manner, when back then I
Mhm.
think it was much more plausible.
Yeah. It
I
might
think there is
also,
the class element involved as well.
and then also just that it is a small town. I think that's
Yes.
another element of it too. There's probably, there may be a mindset that just like, well, you could only be a handful of places, right? I
Right.
mean, he's going to turn up in a few hours, or
And of
probably
course, we're
just run
dealing
out
with
in the
something
woods too
which is
far.
completely supernatural, which no one would have any reason to suspect was going on.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. But yeah,
Yeah.
Hopper does make that point that in the 4 years that he had been the chief of police, the worst crime was an owl attacking a woman's hair because the owl thought it was a nest. Right.
Yeah. So there's also that layer of just a lack of being equipped, or maybe being attuned to there, or maybe not even that so much as just they're sort of um, accustomed to things going a certain way, and just
Right.
it also reminds me of another piece, or very early on with Hopper, where he walks into the police station, and they tell him about something that's going on, and he says,
Oh, about the
coffee,
gnomes.
the morning is just for coffee and
Coffee and
contemplation. I'm not going
contemplation.
to get into
Yeah.
this until later. Yeah.
I love that line. Mornings are for coffee and contemplation. Hopper is one of my favorite characters here.
Yeah, he's definitely, he's fun. I like that. I do think it has a bit of a twist on that kind of what you'd expect from from a character from this era.
Mm-hmm.
So like, it's kind of he's sort of familiar, but has some other layers to him that become more apparent and interesting as the show goes on.
Speaking of that, in terms of recurring themes, did you notice Hopper's bracelet?
I did not.
Okay, that's something to keep an eye out for, because when we first see Hopper, he's passed out on his couch, and he rolls over and you see that he has a blue string bracelet on his arm. That becomes important as this season in particular goes on. So just keep an eye on that. Some other recurring themes you might want to keep an eye on is the idea of trust and people saying, trust me, because that is exactly what Hopper says to Joyce in that scene in the police station. He says, trust me, 9 times out of 10, when this thing happens, it's, the kid has run off to be with the other parent.
Mm-hmm.
And that phrase, trust me, is used repeatedly throughout, not just this season, but throughout the entire series. So the idea of trust is an important motif. And
that's
then,
an interesting one when you think about the 80s era.
yes,
where, with Reagan, with the trust but verify being one of his signature phrases.
right. Very much so. And of course, coming out of the 70s and the Watergate era, when America really first began to distrust government.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So trust, yes, that becomes a big issue. Another recurring theme is the use of tigers and tiger imagery. Did you pick up on that?
Just vaguely. I'm trying to think of where I remember seeing them in the episode.
In this particular episode, there were two images of tigers. One is on a poster in the Byers basement, and then one is Wheelers rather. And then in Castle Byers, there's a stuffed tiger.
What do you think that means?
I'm not sure exactly. But again, as the season goes on, that image will be seen. For one thing, later on, we do see that it becomes, it is the mascot for the school. So it's the Hawkins Tigers.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, we do see that tiger imagery in several places. When we're introduced to Eleven's backstory, we'll see that she had a stuffed tiger as well, which is another thing that connects her with Will.
Oh, yeah.
So why tigers in particular? I don't know, but that's something to keep an eye on.
I'm
And
trying to
then,
think about that.
yeah.
Of course, for me, like the early 80s and being a Michigander, the Tigers were
Oh, yeah, that's a
on our
good
mind
point.
as the baseball team.
Yeah,
I don't
so
think
for
they
us,
were probably as popular in Ohio, but
oh, I'm sure not. But yeah, for us, definitely when we think Tigers, we think Detroit. Yeah.
yeah.
And of course, the Detroit Tigers in the 80s, that was kind of the height of their success. Especially in 85, they won the World Series.
Yeah.
But that's a couple years down the road here.
Yeah, a little early.
Okay, and then some other images that I think work as more foreshadowing. There's the poster of The Thing in Mike's basement. This is the John Carpenter version of The Thing.
Yeah.
I don't know, did you catch that?
Classic. Yeah, I saw that. Of course, I loved it because that's such an incredible movie. And
yes. And of course, the music here, the theme music, harkens back to the music that John Carpenter makes for his movies.
Oh, certainly. Yeah. Although, interestingly, not so much The Thing, because that's the Morricone, right?
That is true. And I think in terms of John Carpenter's movies, I think that may be the only one in which he didn't compose the music, although I'm not positive about that.
I think you're right about that. I'm pretty sure. I'd say with about 95% accuracy.
Right. So yeah, you're right. In that one, it is Ennio Morricone. Mm-hmm. But Morricone's score for The Thing is very imitative of John Carpenter's style.
That's true. Yeah, it does have that weird kind of synthiness. Yeah. And it actually just reminds me of another element, because initially when The Thing bombed, Carpenter was originally going to direct Firestarter, but when The Thing flopped,
was he?
He did not get to do the job.
I did not know that.
Yeah, the Thing's box office failure was responsible for Carpenter not getting the Firestarter gig.
Oh, wow.
It had a lot to do with when it was released. I mean, I think if I remember correctly, the Thing came out at the end of June of 1982.
Mm-hmm.
And that was, I mean, if you think about what was also in the theaters at that point, we're talking like Empire Strikes Back, and we're talking about E.T. So it was.
Well, Empire was in 1980, but yeah, this was.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, going up against E.T. And I think that I've seen a lot of sort of analyses of what happened with the Thing, is that so many people were turned off of the Thing because it was such a negative depiction of alien contact in contrast to E.T. Of course, there's all the violence and gore and body horror.
I feel like they weren't going for the same crowd.
That is true.
There may be some overlap there, but my parents did not take me to see the Thing.
And it is kind of interesting that that poster for the Thing is on Mike's basement. That's not really a kid-friendly movie. But
yeah, I'm trying to think of how they would have seen it. They must have sneaked in, because this is like, unless they had a VHS, I wonder if they had, you know, I mean, it's kind of like
it's possible they had VHS.
Yeah, it's the time frame where more families had a VHS player.
Right. I'm trying to remember the first time I saw the Thing. I know I saw it on VHS, but it would have been several years after this. But still, yeah, I mean, it's odd that, I mean, it makes sense thematically that these kids would be interested in that kind of movie. Yeah. But it is odd that they would have seen it.
But you know, sometimes when I was a kid, I mean, there were times where I had something like that and had not seen the Thing, or the actual,
just because the image is cool.
Because it's cool. Yeah, exactly. Trying to think of an example. I know that, I mean, there were some toys in the 80s that were certainly made from, you know, like a little further down the line. Like, I mean, they're Rambo action figures.
Right.
Like, really? I mean, you know, it's definitely not kid appropriate.
And there were different sort of standards about what was considered child or family appropriate in movies at that time. This is before PG-13, for example. And the Thing was rated R, but still there were sort of looser standards, I think, in what parents thought was appropriate for kids.
Yeah. My guess is that probably a lot of parents took their kids to see it at the drive-in and probably weren't able to watch. And probably like my parents would have never walked me into the proper indoor theater to see it, but would have been, if they wanted to see it, they would have probably just taken me to the drive-in, and then crossed their fingers that I fell asleep before it started or something like that.
And drive-ins were a thing back then. That's a good point.
There's a lot of that. Like I saw a lot of movies that were not necessarily in my age range, because my folks were dying to see them and they played at the drive-in. So Beverly Hills Cop, Rambo.
Oh yeah, I've seen a few of those. But then Poltergeist is mentioned in this episode too. That was a rated R film. I believe it was rated R.
Oh no, that was PG.
That was PG. Yeah,
that kind of lit the fuse for the uproar. Yeah, and then it sort of exploded in '84.
Right. So yeah, and Joyce does take Will to see Poltergeist, making him promise not to have nightmares about it.
Yeah, and then they make a reference to literally the creepiest thing in the whole movie, the clown.
Yeah, exactly. But of course, the Thing is thematic for what happens in the show, particularly with the Demogorgon. Because that is very much a Thing kind of monster.
Yeah.
And then later on in season 3, the Thing is much more heavily influenced or used as one of the bases for that particular storyline. But yeah, the Thing is being set up here as a means of foreshadowing. I think that we're meant to connect that with the monsters from the Upside Down. And then Fireball. So the kids are playing D&D. And as we mentioned, Will is the wizard, and they're attacked by the Demogorgon in the game, and people are the other kids are telling him to throw the fireball. It is, again, a little bit of foreshadowing, because that becomes how they deal with the Demogorgon later on, is to set it on fire. So I just think, you know, that's a nice little detail they're putting in, seeding right there in the beginning. Fireball, that's how you deal with Demogorgons. And of course, the roll of the die fails, and Will says, "The Demogorgon got me," which is exactly what happens to him.
Yeah.
And then there's two other elements of foreshadowing. There is the reference to X-Men number 134. So Dustin and Will are racing on their bikes, racing home. And Dustin says, first one there gets a comic book. And Will says, "I want X-Men 134, specifically that one." How familiar are you with X-Men?
I know most comic book stuff through the movies, I hate to say.
Okay. So this becomes foreshadowing because that is specifically that issue of X-Men introduces Dark Phoenix. It's the first appearance of Dark Phoenix, which we are encouraged later on to view in connection with 11, because Phoenix is very much a powerful telekinetic mutant, which is very sort of parallel to 11. But that whole Dark Phoenix saga storyline, one of the most classic storylines in comic books, they tried adapting it into film twice and never really got it. But that introduces a lot of elements that we will see later on in Stranger Things. So the idea of Cerebro, for example, which is the technology that is used to detect mutants, that's introduced, or at least that's seen heavily in that particular story arc. The Hellfire Club is introduced, which is a group of sort of evil mutants who are trying to take control of Phoenix and cause her to convert to Dark Phoenix. And many of those mutant abilities we will see later on referenced in Stranger Things. But the thing that really about that particular issue that I think is interesting, and that Will really specifies that that's the issue that he wants. And I think it's because now that is one of the most collectible issues and most valuable issues of X-Men and of comic books in general. And I think it highlights the economic disparity between Will and Dustin and the rest of the kids. Again, really highlighting the point that he's a poor kid, right? Everyone else is fairly well off, middle class background, middle class upbringing, more privileged. And so, yeah, that's the issue he wants, I think, because of the collectible and monetary value of it. And then
did it hold that space at that time frame, or is that something that's just happened over?
I certainly it wouldn't have been as valuable then as it is now. But even back then, it was considered an important issue because of, again, the introduction of Dark Phoenix. And that particular storyline was a big deal even then. It was regarded as an instant classic.
That makes sense. Yeah, I'm sure that was probably something that if I was more familiar, I would have immediately jumped out at me. So I can see why that's...
And even when the boys are looking for Will later on in that episode, Dustin is trying to lure him out by saying, "Hey, I got your copy of X-Men 134 right here." And then the other bit of foreshadowing is when Hopper says, "I always had a distaste for science." This is when Mr. Clark introduces himself to Hopper during the search party.
Yeah.
What do you think? How do you think that reveals, or what do you think that reveals about Hopper?
I think it's, on the surface, it reminds me of some of these other dismissive remarks that he's made. He's kind of this arrogance that he has to a degree of just like, oh, I know, I have instinct. I could see him saying something like, "I have instinct. I don't need other things," or something, or "I know my gut," because that's, kind of the antithesis of like thinking scientifically. And so I felt that it was there to sort of like, just further make a distinction between him and, maybe even, and the kids. I think he makes reference to a teacher that he didn't like right after that too, if I remember correctly. And then that science teacher says, "Oh, she's still there," or something. And
it makes a joke about how I'm not surprised mummies never die.
Yeah, it's funny.
So it is an offhand, amusing comment. Yeah.
Yeah, and then he, I mean, and that science teacher is really kind of a friend mentor character for the crew, also.
Very much so.
So it's so it does kind of, that sort of distancing from that space certainly stood out to me.
Yeah. And you do kind of get the sense that, that makes sense with Hopper. Hopper's just like a working class guy who just doesn't really have time for that, intellectual stuff. And he does mention that his daughter was very interested in science and he just couldn't keep up with her.
Yeah.
But I think it also helps to delineate, as the series goes on, the contrast between Hopper and Dr. Brenner, or Papa, as we come to know him, who's very much the scientist, the evil mad scientist. So yeah, Hopper saying, I always had a distaste for science.
Yeah,
that's
actually really
something.
Some really strong foreshadowing there now that you mentioned that, 'cause I was thinking, yeah, because as he becomes more of an important figure for 11 as the series goes on. It's an interesting,
very much so,
parallel. Yeah,
because and spoiler here, Hopper does take on a father figure relationship with these characters, 11 in particular.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Okay.
So it turns out to be kind of a growth, moment for like a growth piece for his character, which
that's a good point. Yeah, because I mean, we see him here's at the beginning of the story, he's very much the kind of the drunkard, the sad sack kind of character. And so we do see not just him, but all the characters grow and evolve as the story progresses.
Yeah, and that plotline with 11 sort of allows him to have kind of a redemptive element, given what he references about what happened to his daughter. So that's the other short, like in that exchange about the science, I think shortly after that is when we learn that his daughter is not alive anymore.
Exactly. It's almost immediately after, he talks about his daughter, and Mr. Clark asks, well, what grade is she in? And one of the other people in the search party says, well, she died a few years ago.
Yeah, because he says she's with her mom, they're in the city or something like that. Vague, but
and there's the suggestion that it happened before he became the chief of police here. So I'm not sure if that's really relevant, but I think it does hint at something in his backstory.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's funny when you think about when you've seen the entire series and watching that character evolve. I think he became more of a fan favorite over time as he became more part of the story and had more layers to him. I think I remember people saying like, oh, the hot cop and stuff like, and I think he even parlayed it into that little, he was on one episode of SNL even. So he kind of had a moment there.
Right. And, I can see that because when we're introduced to that character, like I said, he's passed out on his couch. He's not presented in a very positive way. And even when he makes it finally into the office, he's like, don't bother me with what's going on. Mornings are for coffee and contemplation. He just seems like a deadbeat kind of character, but it turns out he's really good at his job. And when he sees Will's bike abandoned there off the road, it clicks in his head. Okay, there's something really serious going on here. And I think it's that point where we start to view him in a much more positive way.
Yeah, and it's interesting. The first, we talked about this earlier, but he's introduced on the couch. It's like sleeping on the couch, and it's my first thought when I saw that was like, why is he on the couch sleeping? And because he apparently lives on his own, and it just seemed kind of, I think it's meant to tell you a certain thing about this character, or they want you to think a certain way about him initially, and then that provides that space for him to kind of grow and evolve. And it's just another example of how lovingly these creators have such an attention to detail, and it's fun to see them play with those tropes and
Mhm.
leverage them. They have such a great balance of presenting things that are familiar to people that are kind of in our age bracket, that
Right.
will go, oh, it's like ET, or oh, there's a poster of the thing on the
Yes.
wall. And yet it's interesting, because even, you know, if it was only an exercise in nostalgia, it certainly wouldn't have gotten as popular as it has.
Yes. Yeah, so yeah, definitely it speaks to us of our generation by giving us that really powerful nostalgia hit. But at the same time, it's just a really good story. So I think that is, you know, it's very well written. And so that's one of the reasons, one of the keys as to its success is, yeah, it's not just like a nostalgia trip, or it's not just trying to cash in on nostalgia. It's actually saying something which is relevant and meaningful to people.
The other thing that struck me about this little, you know, there's another thing about this little group of kids that also alludes to some of those two big influences. You know, the Stevens, is just that, you know, you've got this little group of kids, which reminds me of the Losers Club and It, and then also,
yes.
you know, and then of course there's always the Goonies, and there were and other films too that weren't Spielberg, though, like, you know, kind of as a bit of a Monster Squad vibe too, which is a movie that
Yes.
luckily has sort of had a good resurgence now that they put it out digitally and people can find it again.
And that whole sort of genre of children in peril from the 1980s in those movies, like Explorers and stuff like that, which you don't really see anymore.
Oh yeah, yeah, Explorers is another example too. It's
And
funny the way that there's I feel like if you think about those versus like the recent versions of It, which really push the gas down on the children in peril element to a place that is far, you know, more disturbing than some of the stuff that goes on in the films in the 80s.
And it's interesting that you do bring up It, because the Duffer Brothers were developing an adaptation of It that they wanted to make, which they weren't allowed to because they weren't well known enough. So they created this show instead, and it's because of the popularity of this show that the remake of It ended up getting made, along with using Finn Wolfhard from this show as one of the main characters.
Yeah, in his film.
So it's all connected.
He's like the go-to genre guy now. He's in the newer Ghostbusters film.
I know. Which,
speaking of nostalgia exercises that are fun fan service.
Which, by the way, I loved that movie.
Oh, I just watched it last weekend with my kids. It was such a blast. I thought it was so much fun.
And we will talk about Ghostbusters later on when we get to season 2, because that's one of these sort of fundamental texts for that particular storyline.
Yeah, that's a summer I think that most of us who were around like will always have this special feeling about, because of those films. Like there's so many great movies that they hit in that summer.
Very much so. I mean, 84, 85, pretty much 1980 through 85 in particular had such great movies come out at that point. So then, before we sign off, let's have a homework assignment. Yeah, so this class began as this podcast began as a university course, a literature course. So naturally, there's going to be homework involved. And I like to, if possible, get the audience involved by doing a little bit of homework. So obviously, you need to watch the next episode, Chapter 2 of Stranger Things. That's what we will discuss next time. But also, when I taught this class, I would have my students give short presentations in every class period on a special topic that of relevance to the 1980s that connected to the show. And one of those topics is new wave music. So in those presentations, I would have my students just say, okay, explain what that topic was. In this case, what is new wave music? Explain why it was important, and explain its sort of long-term effects. So for our audience, see if you can answer those questions, and we will discuss those next time. So look into new wave music and then watch Chapter 2 of the first season of Stranger Things. So I'd like to thank my friend and colleague, Brian, for joining us. Brian, is there anything you want to plug?
Well, I write for a magazine here, and I'm in Bloomington, Indiana, and I write for a magazine that covers film and art and music, and it's called The Rider, and it's RYDER, and I have several articles that are up out there. I also write for with some friends for a website called the Words and Music Club, where we take a theme and a song, and then we write something that ties those elements together. So we'll, for example, the one I'm working on right now that's not up, the theme is found. And so I'm currently trying to decide what that's going to be. The last thing I wrote was related to work. And so it was actually a rather unfortunate instance of my work life that is on the art that is out there to read about. But fortunately, I think the writing came out better than the life situation.
Awesome. So if our listeners have any questions or things that you want us to answer or discuss on the show, go ahead and send me an email. That you can reach me by email at dreadpirateproductions@gmail.com. So go ahead and send us some questions or anything you want us to discuss in the show, and we will touch on those in future episodes. Okay. Brian, you mentioned that you're in Indiana, so not too far from Hawkins. So watch out for the stranger things out there. Okay, thanks again, and I will talk to you again next time.
Stranger Things in the 1980s is produced by Dread Pirate Productions. Cover art is by Sherry Archer. The theme music is Cobalt by Alex Bloxham, used under license from Filmstro. Send questions or topic suggestions to dreadpirateproductions@gmail.com.